Welcome to this, and good evening, to this third lecture in our series, Times of Festival. The series focuses on festivals as events that harbor temporal disjunctions, preserving old, elsewhere out-of-date art forms, as well as fostering the developments of new genres. We started this series with a lecture spanning 5 centuries and 3 countries, Italy, France, and Germany, a lecture by the musicologist Michael Fendt. And in the second lecture last month, Unvar Rustem from Johns Hopkins University discussed a series of magnificent mosques that were built by the Ottoman sultans in 18th century Istanbul. And he concentrated in particular on the royal pavilions attached to these and how this new type of building developed out of weekly processions by the rulers, of which they became, among other things, permanent manifestations. If you have missed any of these lectures or want to revisit them, they are now becoming available as podcasts on our website, where you can also see the dates for the forthcoming events. Today's lecture marks the end of the first term, and the series spans over 3 terms. At the same time, this paper is the first of 3 lectures on festivals in Renaissance Italy within the series. On the 20th of January, Reinhard Strom from Oxford University will speak about Laus Urbium, early musical compositions on the praise of cities. And on the 24th of February, Matteo Cassini from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, but also in Venice, brings us to Venice with his lecture, A Society on Shows State Processions in Renaissance Venice, 1495 to 1600. I'm also delighted to say that both Reinhard and Matteo, as well as François Kiviget, who is going to speak later in the program, are with us here in the digital worldwide Warburg. As I discussed in my introduction to the series in October, for A.B. Warburg, it was the festlich bewegtes Leben of Renaissance Italy and Florence in particular, the life that moved to a festive rhythm that unleashed the generative powers of ancient pathos formula and motives. In the third lecture of the spring term, after this Italian series, Susanne Küchler from UCL will examine this notion, Warburg's notion, from the point of view of the modern anthropologist and widen also again the geographic outlook of our series beyond Europe. When I conceived this series in May, I was thinking, or I was coming originally from Florentine festivals on which I've worked myself, and especially the Festa di San Giovanni with its evolving use of ephemera, from the Republican Cherry to spectacular courtly floats and the Sacre Rappresentazioni, sacred drama or theater that develops in the context of these feste. And in that context, for anybody working on sacred theater in Italy, in Italian early Renaissance, Nerida Newbigin is a more than familiar name. Based at Sydney University, where it is now already tomorrow morning, Nerida has dedicated her entire professional life to the analysis and presentation of Sacre Rappresentazioni through articles, books, and substantial editions of original texts. Here at the Warburg Institute, Nerida gave a paper in 1992 on politics in Sacra Rappresentazione of Lorenzo's Florence, in which she emphasized not only the origin of religious drama in the context of the Feste, but also how the courtly theater took over and replaced the earlier festivals. Nerida has an endless list of publications, of which I'm only referring to 2 or 3. In 2013, a large book appeared in collaboration with the art historian Barbara Wisch, Acting on Faith, the Confraternity of the Gonfalone in Renaissance Rome. In 2019, she published a contribution, Serio Ludere, Confraternities and Drama in Central Italy, 1400 to 1600, in Konrad Eisenbichler's A Companion to Medieval and Early Modern Confraternities. And I'm delighted to see that Konrad is with us this evening. And she is about to publish Making a Play for God, the Sacre Rappresentazioni of Renaissance Florence, which is going to come out in a series run by Konrad Eisenbichler in 2021. Tonight, or this morning, as it's in Sydney, Nerida will speak on From the Beginning to World Without End, the history of man's salvation in the San Giovanni procession of 1454. And I'm delighted to hand over to Nerida Newbigin. Nerida.
Thank you very much, Eckhart. I shall just click all the appropriate buttons, I hope. Are we right?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for your introduction, and good evening to everybody, including some old and dear friends from tomorrow morning in Sydney, where it's already getting on towards 20 degrees Celsius. And I'm delighted to be talking about a subject that is so closely aligned with the interests of Abbey Wartburg and with the Warburg Institute that bears his name. My broad subject is the feast in honour of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist, whose image adorned the city's gold florins, shown here with the lily, the flower of the city's patron, Mary, on one side and the Baptist on the other. The Patronal Feast Day was celebrated in Florence over 14 days, around the 24th of June. It included a general 14-day amnesty that allowed everybody to return home with immunity from all prosecution and possibly even the COVID virus. It had a display of mercantile wealth and wares, offerings by the civic authorities of wax and candles to the baptistry, dedicated, of course, to St. John the Baptist. It had a procession of clergy and confraternities with a display of relics. It had tribute to the signoria from Florence's subject territories. There was a procession of ceri, or wagons, that you see here in this mid-16th century fresco, with fireworks and public display. It had horse races and parties and weddings, feasting, dancing, and finery. But I'll focus on just 2 aspects of the procession of clergy and confraternities, before and after the return of the reform of the festa in 1454. I'll look first at the nature of the edifici and humanistic theorizing about their classical origins, and second, at the edificio of the Annunciation, with all its trappings and the incorporation of antique authority into folk ritual. There's a long tradition among Florentines of laudatory prose and verse describing the festa of San Giovanni. And as a result, we're fortunate to have a range of first-hand descriptions of the festa. The early chroniclers and visitors describe a shambolic procession on the 23rd of June, the eve of the feast day, that incorporated clergy, relics, giants and stilt walkers, a dragon, effigies of saints, as well as the babies from the Foundling Hospital, borne on litters many meters high through the streets. In 1454, the ascetic, observant Dominican Bishop of Florence, Antoninus, had had enough. He separated the solemn religious elements from the unashamedly popular. The clergy, both regular and secular, processed as before on the 23rd of June, bearing the relics preserved in their churches, confraternities, crosses, banners, and torches. But a new procession was instituted for the 22nd of June. The Edifici, together with the 4 youth confraternities and a similar number of adult confraternities, formed themselves into an orderly sequence to recount the history of man's salvation from the creation of the world to the Last Judgment, followed by the story of the 3 dead kings and the 3 live kings. There's no mention in 1454 of dragons and stilt walkers, and for a time they probably disappeared. I've translated 2 of the most detailed 15th century descriptions and posted them on my Italian Renaissance Theatre website. They come from a year or 2 before Antonino's reform of 1454. That's the first one, and the other from the year, from immediately after the festa of that year. And it's through a close examination of these 2 descriptions that we discern the way in which the antique visual iconography and ideas were co-opted to mask the remnants of pagan practices in the Festa di San Giovanni. The first description is by Agostino di Portico, a Camaldolese monk and abbot of the monastery of San Zeno in Pisa, which was discovered and published by Daniela del Corno Branca. The reference is given here. Sometime between 1451 and 1453, Agostino sent to Sister Battista, a nun in the Augustinian convent of Santa Marta in Siena, a long description of the procession he had just witnessed in Florence, an offering of virtual spiritual tourism to a cloistered nun who had chosen Battista as her professed name. He describes the press of people in their finery, the impossibility of seeing anything in the crush, and then being taken to a house overlooking the Piazza della Signoria, from which he could watch the procession pass. He tells us that first came the 3 hospitals, San Gallo, La Scala, and the Innocenti, with their processional cross. They were followed by, quote, many loads of little children in great baskets covered with flowers and all with garlands in their hair, followed by wet nurses, something that filled him with devotion and pity. The children were followed by the regular clergy, Jesuits, Third Order Franciscans, Dominicans, Servites, Carmelites, Augustinians, and then the Umiliati of Ognissanti. The Umiliati, custodians of the relic of San Rossore that the Florentines had acquired from Pisa in 1422, carried it on, I quote, a wonderful edificio 20 braccia high, that's nearly 12 meters high, with much adornment, full of living children who looked like angels, with wings, singing and playing, fiddles and cymbals, and turning around as if they were dancing. And they were up so high I was amazed they were not afraid. This edificio was carried by 60 men or more. It was so big. When it arrived in front of the palazzo, it stopped, and there they sang and played. Now I want to explore the question of what is meant by the term edificio. Literally, the word means building, an edifice, a building, but it's also the word for scaffolding used in construction, and here it refers to a towering superstructure or framework mounted on a platform, itself called a scaffold, that was carried by porters and placed on trestles in the piazza. On the platform and scaffolding, children and young people posed or performed, representing or acting out scenes of religious significance. When Vasari designed the program of decorations, including this scene, for Eleonora of Toledo's apartments in the Palazzo Vecchio in the early 1560s, the edifici with their representations were no longer part of the festa. Here you see the procession of the 24th with the war chariot and palio and other wagons carrying the decorated ceri. And when Vasari came to write about the edifici a few years later, in the second edition of the life of Francesco d'Angelo called Il Cecca, he was performing an act of festive archaeology because the edifici had long since been replaced by other entertainments. The single representation of an edificio that does survive comes from a cassone panel representing the triumph of Alfonso of Aragon, entering Naples in 1443, but painted 2 or 3 decades later. The allegorical triumph, modelled on the iconographical tradition of Petrarch's Trionfi, was staged by the Florentine merchants of Naples. On the left, you can see Alfonso riding on a chariot. In the middle are Justice, Julius Caesar on an orb, and Fortune. But it is Fortune, this figure here, Fortune, which I'll show you in more detail, with her hair swept forward. No, she just, sorry, so that she cannot be seized from behind after she has passed. It's on Fortune that I wish to concentrate. She stands on a golden vessel that sits in turn on a platform draped with a magnificent cloth decorated with the crests of the Ridolfi and Segni families. And peeping out below the cloth are the liveried feet of the porters. The edificio above is nowhere near the 20 braccia described by Agostino di Portico, nor could the format of the cassone panel have accommodated such a structure. But a comparable structure is still carried through the streets of Viterbo for the Festa di Santa Rosa on the 3rd of September each year. Here we see a team of sturdy porters supporting the wooden platform on their shoulders, and they do it in relays that they keep on changing because it is so enormous and so heavy. And here's the full macchina di Santa Rosa as it's carried along. So let me now go back to the edificio of the early 1450s. As I said, not nearly so tall, and carried, it supported, it had on top of it child actors, living children who looked like angels with wings, singing and playing fiddles and cymbals and turning around as if they were dancing. Seeking some insight into the preparation of this spectacle, I recently turned my attention to the archives of the Ospedale degli Innocenti, now far more readily accessible than they were when the late Philip Gavitt studied them in the 1980s. There, to my surprise, from 1448 to 1452, but not beyond 1452, I found payments concerning the edifici, and in particular a back payment early in 1449 to the ironmonger for ironmongery he lent when he made 6 edifici for the feast of San Giovanni to carry children. There were also payments for tunics and wings for the angelic children. Midwives and their husbands were bussed in from the countryside or picked up by a horse and cart, and they joined the residents of the orphan hospital for a supper, which had as its starting point 400 eggs. So it was a fairly large and well-catered affair. So here is secondary corroboration of the participation of live children in the edifici of San Giovanni. But what of the antique, you may ask? At this point, I go back to Biondo Flavio, 1392 to 1463, who was with Pope Eugenius IV when he sought refuge in Florence in 1434. And he was probably still there or again there during the Council of Florence in 1439. Biondo was actively involved with Eugenius and Antoninus in the reform of the Florentine confraternities in the 1440s. And he returned yet again to Florence with the court of Pius II in 1459, by which time he had largely completed his monumental Roma Triumphans, his labor of the previous 2 years. Just 4 pages from the end, when he comes to talk about military triumphs, he takes Josephus's description of the triumph of Titus in his De Bello Judaico and draws a direct parallel between the pig butter or floats of antiquity and the edifici of the Festa di San Giovanni. Biondo describes the Florentine edifici as being decked with, and I quote, wrought iron branches that branched 3 and 3 again and were covered in a great quantity of dense gold and silver foliage, and among them were positioned birds' nests, as it were, made of leather and strips of hide of various colours as cribs for small children of 2 or 3 years at the most. Some had just their heads out, some showed their whole bodies, and it was charming and funny to hear what they babbled according to the suggestion of their prompter hidden in the foliage. The massive construction was carried about by a crowd of slaves dressed not in patchwork rags, as happens in Florence now, but in crimson and gold. Biondo is not arguing for influence or imitation, nor am I claiming direct influence of the humanist historian on the Florentine festaioli. Rather, Biondo is pointing to a continuity in the visual vocabulary of the festa from antiquity to the present that must have been observed by and discussed with like-minded eruditi of his day. But before I leave the question of babies in nests, I want to show another image that Patricia Simons has brought to my attention. It's a pen and ink drawing showing just such a highly decorative frond, complete with baby in nest. And it's now in the Palace Collections Museum in Istanbul, forming part of an album that was possibly compiled as a gift to the Sultan Mehmed by the Florentine merchant Benedetto Dei. The whole drawing is quite licentious. Benedetto Dei was one of the Festaioli in 1451 and 1452, the years that the Festa blew its budget, and the drawing may be a comic riff on the scenic effect gone wrong of the edificio with the children. In second position in the procession described by Agostino di Portico came the Camaldolese monks with their edificio of the Annunciation, which was, I quote, carried by 70 men or more. And this edificio was very high, and there were lots of little angels who sang and played and danced. And above them was a Virgin Annunciate, a living person, and the angel. And she was so beautiful, and her clothes were so fine that she looked just like her. And the angel likewise was a living person and had wings. When it arrived in front of the Signoria, it stopped. The angel and Our Lady were on two great fronds of pinks or carnations. The angel knelt and said Ave Maria and everything that follows in the gospel. And Our Lady replied and made all those gestures of et quo modo fiat, how can that be? At the end, she said, Ecce ancilla Domini, behold the handmaiden of the Lord, and at once a live dove flew out and descended upon her. This was all so devout that it brought tears to the eyes and made me weep. There's no suggestion yet that this is a full play, but there can at least be little doubt that the edificio of the San Giovanni procession was associated with the Festa of San Felice, the Annunciation Festa staged in San Felice in Piazza by the confraternity attached to the church and adjoining Camaldolese monastery in the Oltrarno. Having described the edificio, Agostino's eye is drawn back to the figures that preceded it. They were the prophet David on horseback, and many prophets and pages in livery, and lots of people dressed up in the latest fashion, and live spiritelli. And besides this, ahead of these prophets, there was a great and terrible basilisk that had the body of a rooster but a very long tail like a serpent. The spiritelli are the stilt walkers, but I want to look at the basilisk, the dragon of other descriptions. And this basilisk needs further explanation. It must here represent the forces of evil, like the asp and the basilisk of Psalm 90. Thou shalt walk upon the asp and the basilisk, and thou shalt trample underfoot the lion and the dragon. The incarnation of Christ at the Annunciation, foretold by the prophets, will bring victory over this terrible beast. But Agostino's basilisk is also related to another mythic dragon. In his Summa de Ecclesiasticis Officiis, the 12th century Parisian theologian Jean Bellet discussed the rituals celebrated at the Feast of the Nativity of the Baptist. There are various versions of the text, but they all refer to the custom of collecting and burning dragon's bones and carrying the embers in procession to produce smoke, because in this season, that is the Midsummer Festival of St. John the Baptist, in this season, dragons become aroused by the heat and fly through the air and inseminate wells and fountains. which will lead to a bad year, but burning the bones will ward them off. There's no evidence that I have found of a conscious recollection of this belief, excuse me, in the Florentine procession. But the dragon continued to make an appearance into the 16th century, almost always in the company now of St. George, as in the 1439 procession described by a Greek visitor. The prophets, however, are another matter. David is a recurring presence in the cavalcades of the Florentine Feast Day. He appears as a man of great age, presumably as King David, with the Magi in the San Giovanni procession of 1428. Again, the following year, so January 1429, at Epiphany, he is presumably the youthful David who killed the giant with his slingshot. Here, however, he's singled out among the prophets. He is the one prophet who stands for the many who prophesied the coming of Christ. I'm now going to abandon Agostino di Portico's description to turn to the reforms of 1454. The revised constitutions of the Florentine See, which we know only in a vernacular version, published by Richard Trexler in 1979, who dated it very plausibly to around 1453. The constitutions restated the aim of the religious procession, quote, to lead people to devotion, and observed that from time to time, intermingled with that observance, there have been vanities and worldly spectacles that would ill adorn carnival, let alone a procession. To remedy this worldliness, Antoninus separated the procession of the religious from the procession of edifici, and ordered that no member of any confraternity or any other people with any devices or contrivances or rappresentazioni or spectacles with people on foot or on horseback I've lost the rest of that sentence, so that the procession can be done more devoutly and without interruption, and for the salvation of souls and not their perdition. Otherwise, the procession will not be allowed to take place. And anyone who wishes to do a rappresentazione should do so in some other time and place. The commune appointed new festaioli to organize the festivities, among them Matteo Palmieri, humanist, historiographer, apothecary, the person who commissioned the wonderful Botticini painting in your National Gallery. Palmieri, who had served time as gonfaloniere of Giustizia in 1453. The task was not an easy one, and the festaioli were forced to denounce a number of organizations, including the Innocenti, for non-compliance with the new rules. But it's thanks to this denunciation that we now know that Palmieri, the author of the second great description of the festa, was also one of its organizers, and was probably himself the person responsible for the detail of the changes in 1454. Palmieri and his team marshaled the floats for the first time into a narrative order: the creation and fall of the angels and the creation and fall of Adam, Moses receiving the law, the Annunciation, the Nativity with Octavian and the Sibyl, a second Nativity with the Magi, the resurrection and harrowing of hell, the arrival of the blessed in the earthly paradise, the Ascension of Christ, and finally the three living kings and the three dead kings and the Last Judgment. The Passion was omitted, Palmieri tells us, on the grounds that it was unsuitable for such a festa. The Creation and Fall plays were staged by the four youth confraternities, reformed by Antoninus in the 1440s. The Annunciation, presumably done again by the Laudese Company of San Felice, who staged the Festa di San Felice. The Magi Company, the subject of Rab Hatfield's 1970 study, still unsurpassed, performed themselves. The three resurrection edifici were the responsibility of the Resurrection Company of San Basilio, the Armenian Orthodox Church at Canto alle Macine in the heart of Medici territory. The Ascension was done by the Sant'Agnese Confraternity in Santa Maria del Carmine, and the Last Judgment was the responsibility, according to Benedetto Dei, of Santa Maria dei Servi, possibly the Laudese Company of the Annunziata, which met there. But the innovation I want to talk about here relates to the Sibyls, who appear with the Edifici for the first time in 1454. Palmieri lists them as follows. He says there were various prophets and sibyls with her Mistress Majestas and others who prophesied the incarnation of Christ. Più profeti e sibille con Hermes Trimegisto et altri profetizzatori dell'incarnazione di Cristo. The ninth element was the edificio of the Annunciation of the Virgin that did her representation. 10, the Emperor Octavian, that is Augustus Caesar, with a great cavalcade, and with the Sibyl who predicted to him that Christ was to be born and showed him the Virgin in the sky with Christ in her arms. 11, the Templum Pacis, with the edificio of the Nativity to do its representation. The Sibyls are irresistibly fascinating. Everybody has a nibble at the problem, but there is very little advance in our overall understanding of how their texts were transmitted. Here, in Palmieri's description, there is no indication of how many there were, più profeti e sibille, which ones were there, and whether they and the prophets spoke or carried placards or banderoles with their prophecies, as they do in so many visual representations. Charles Dempsey, in his Berenson Lectures of 2008, published subsequently in 2012 as The Early Renaissance and Vernacular Culture, explored the way in which classical culture was assimilated into vernacular culture. As a case study, he took the series of 8-line stanzas spoken by prophets and sibyls that appeared in a variety of contexts, as the prophets and sibyls of Baccio Baldini, formerly attributed to Maso Finiguerra, the anonymous Annunciation, printed in the 1490s and wrongly attributed to Feo Belcari, whose play of the Annunciation is quite different and far more elegant and not printed until modern times. And in the play of the Purification, performed annually in the Youth Confraternity of the Purification from 1449 onwards, at first only with prophets and subsequently with prophets and sibyls. Dempsey proposed that Feo Belcari was the author of these verses, but the fact that Belcari is not the author of the printed Annunciation undermines that part of his argument. Nevertheless, his study provides other valuable insights. There's little doubt that the sudden popularity and pairing of the prophets and sibyls began around 1430, when Masolino decorated the robing chamber in the villa of Giordano Orsini at Monte Giordano, just outside Rome, with prophets and sibyls, each with his or her prophecy in Latin. In 1434, Orsini followed his close friend and ally, Eugenius IV, into exile and spent much of the time until his death 4 years later, in 1438, with Eugenius in Florence and then Bologna. And he may well have shared both words and copies of the images with his friends. Even after his death, the villa in Rome continued to attract visitors, including Giovanni Rucellai in 1450. But it was destroyed by his enemies, the Colonna, in the 1480s. Transcriptions of the Orsini prophecies circulated amongst humanists and princes as they planned decorative programs of their own. Orsini may have shared them with Palmieri. After all, Palmieri was depicted among the select group of illustrious men in another room of the villa, the Sala Teatri. The Sibyl cycles of the Casa Romei in Ferrara around 1450, in the Tempio Malatistiano of Rimini in 1454, in Siena Cathedral, seen here in the 1480s, are certainly related to the Orsini Sibyls. In 1481, a transcription of the Sibylline prophecies in Latin, accompanied by woodcuts of the Sibyls, was printed in a collection of opuscula, along with Filippo Barbieri's Discordantiae. And this collection of Sibyls is commonly, but quite erroneously, attributed to Barbieri. Barbieri's 16th Discordantia, or point of difference between Jerome and Augustine, concerns the legitimacy of using pagan prophecies to foretell the coming of Christ. In the first edition of the Discordantiae, it's followed directly by the Dicta Sibyllarum, with woodcuts to illustrate Barbieri's assertion. In the second edition, with the same printer's preface and colophon and date, but probably later and by a different printer, the validity of the Sibylline prophecies is further reinforced by the inclusion of Augustine's chapter from the City of God on the signs of the Last Judgment acrostic, and of Lactantius's affirmation of the divine institutes, of the authenticity of the prophecies of Hermes Trismegistus and the Sibyls. In this new edition, 10 Sibyls are joined by 9 Old Testament prophets and John the Baptist. Here you can see the prophet Ezekiel facing the Samian Sibyl, although I have to say it may originally have been intended that she should face David. There's also a nativity scene, Christ with the instruments of the Passion, and finally, Plato, captioned with the first verse of St. John's Gospel. As you can see in this next slide, the text below the woodcut differs from one edition to the next, as do the woodcuts themselves. These two editions were printed more than 25 years after the Procession of 1454, but they attest to the way in which the Sibylline and Old Testament prophecies continued to circulate in a multiplicity of forms in the context of the revival of Platonism. Closer in time to the 1454 prophecy, the 1454 procession, is the list of sibyls and prophets of Christ, included by Marco di Bartolomeo Rustici in his account of his imagined trip to the Holy Land. As he sailed past Cuma, with Petrarch's Itinerario as his model, he uses the site of Cuma on the shore as his pretext for a discussion of the sibyls, and he interpolates into his narrative a list of the 10 Ursini sibyls and their prophecies, combining the citation of authorities that we find in Lactantius and their prophecies. A closely related vernacular list is found in Ricardiana manuscript 1271. And I add in passing that it is this vernacular version that forms the basis of Bilcari's 5 stanzas for the 8 sibyls of the Annunciation. So the sibyls were already circulating in Florence before Bilcari incorporated them into his authentic Annunciation. But the sibyls have a way of tangling us up in philological questions. So I will get back to my point if I can. In imposing order on the chaos of the San Giovanni procession, Palmieri and his fellow festaioli called on the sibyls, who elevated the tone of the procession of prophets, integrating the glories of classical antiquity into the narrative and revealing God's plan in the history of man's salvation. One sibyl took her role further. Following the edificio of the Annunciation came the first of 2 nativity floats. On the first was constructed a temple of peace, quite possibly like the one remembered in the so-called Florentine picture chronicle of the British Museum. Children dressed as angels were perched on top of the temple and were almost knocked down by a mad German who disrupted the performance. Although the Sibyl of the Araceli legend is traditionally the Tiburtine Sibyl, here the artist called her the Delphic Sibyl. And drew her facing the Temple of Peace. The image bears no relationship to the Templum Pacis in Rome, but it's possibly indebted to the Temple of Hercules Victor in the Forum Boarium, formerly believed to be a temple of Vesta. But it could serve a very theatrical purpose. A playtext survives, copied in 1463, that is probably directly related to this edificio. In the temple, Octavian first consults his sages about how long the temple will stand and is told that it will survive until a virgin gives birth. He then consults an unnamed Sibyl about whether he should declare himself a god, as his people demand. The Sibyl shows him a vision of the Virgin and Child in the sky, the vision of the Araceli, at which point that 8-columned temple falls away, as the sages had foretold, to reveal a nativity scene with the shepherds. The legend of the Araceli is relatively rare in Florence, and it reappears in the Sassetti Chapel of Santa Trinita, where it links the golden age of Augustus to the glories of Medici in Florence. The legend also cements one last continuity. According to the Florentine tradition, the baptistry, octagonal like the Temple of Peace, built in the reign of the Emperor, octagonal like the Temple of Peace, though theatrically less versatile, was believed to have been the Temple of Mars, constructed in the reign of Octavian around the time of Christ's birth. The goldsmith, Marco di Bartolomeo Rustici, in his usual fashion, garbles the syntax and chronology, but his contemporary, Matteo Palmieri, brought to the Festa of 1454, with its sweep of universal history from the beginning to the end of time, all the conviction of Christian and classical tradition. Thank you.